sort of covering a little bit of ground we've already covered here, but just to remind you, we pretty clearly established that Aristotle rejects Plato's option of the kingly or rule of the wise, and he has a lot of reasons why. But one of them is that if he does acknowledge that these wise are among us, and that in a sort of ideal sense, if they could always rule, we'd have pretty good government. But there is one problem with that nonetheless, and that is that everybody else is excluded from power, and he says this would cause them dishonor because, you see, he thinks that people are capable of judgment. We've seen that very clearly. He makes distinctions amongst people, but he says men and even women are capable of judgment and discretion, and therefore they really are not, most of them, merely willing to, or content to follow, and will feel dishonor. And if you have a large amount of your population who's excluded and doesn't like it, then your city is not going to run as well. It's not going to be, they're not going to be satisfied, and when people aren't satisfied, they tend to not cooperate, right? So they need to be included, and the rule of the wise does not make that possible. He also says that the rule of the wise is, the wise are very rare, and most of the time people think they're wise, but they're not. And if you give these people power, you do not get the results Plato would have wished. Okay, so the practical solution that he proposes, as we know, is what he calls the polity. Okay, the polity is the best that you can do in his view, because the ideal isn't possible, and really, in at least this one way, isn't even desirable, because he thinks that Plato was wrong about the majority of people being so willing to follow. You may remember Plato said that in order to make the republic work well, you had to lie to people. You had to tell them this story of the myth of metals and hope that they would believe it, that the vast majority of people were the bronze class, and their great virtue was moderation and to basically follow. Well, obviously Aristotle does not think that such a policy would work, and in fact, having to lie to people or to tell them a story to get them to accept it begs the question, if they're followers by nature, why do we need to tell them a story? If they're followers by nature, then why do we have this problem to begin with? Okay. Well, Aristotle says obviously most people are not simply followers by nature. They want to share in rule. They have this judgment. They have free will. So we have to harness that somehow. We can't let it run rampant, which is what happens in a pure democracy, which leads to results that he doesn't like. But we have to give them some measure of power and participation, or that won't work either. If they'll be too dissatisfied. So he gives us a couple of arguments which I hinted at, but we didn't really look at in any detail last time. And I think I mentioned they're like John Stuart Mill's argument. Very much reminds me of Aristotle's argument. John Stuart Mill said there's a wisdom in the mass of people, in the masses of people. Okay, that no one individual has, okay, but when they all combine, there's a wisdom that's actually greater than the wisdom of one or few. Aristotle says on the top of page 83, for the many who are not as individuals excellent men, nevertheless can, when they come together, be better than the few best people, not individually but collectively, just as feasts to which many contribute are better than feasts provided at one person's expense. Well, that's kind of an interesting observation. Well, what do you think that's true? And what could he be thinking of there? That feasts that are to which many contribute are better than feasts provided at one person's expense? Thanksgiving. Yeah, where many people contribute. Why is that better?
like each person has a part of like ownership in
Yeah, yeah.
not just one person with all the like control.
That's interesting, isn't it? You know, I mean, what happens at Thanksgiving when Grandma brings something and the aunt brings something and so forth? Pretty soon you've got this lavish spread of food. Everybody compliments everybody else. At least that's what they should do, right? Thank you, it's wonderful and tasty. Sometimes we have to maybe kind of fudge a little bit if you don't like something, but you pay respect to each other in that way. So that may be what Aristotle is getting at, is why it's better, is because then the feast is not just about the food, it's about the people too, and you're all contributing to it. So he says, for being many, each of them can have some part of virtue and practical wisdom, and when they come together, the multitude is just like a single human being with many feet, hands, and senses, and so too for their character traits and wisdom. That is why the many are better judges of music and of the poets. For the one of them judges one part and another, and all of them the whole thing. Okay, there's another interesting observation that he makes. He says that the many are better judges of the works of music and of the poets. Do you think that's true? Okay. So how would we translate this into something we understand? Okay, because of course music is still relevant. But I mean, when you go looking for music, you want to spend some money on music, do you read what other people have to say about it? Okay, so you read reviews, some of you anyway. I definitely do. And these days, of course, you can actually listen to it ahead of time too, so that you know for sure if you want to invest in it. Movies. Do you just go willy-nilly to the movie just because the title sounds cool, or do you read reviews? I do too. So that I won't be disappointed, you know. I don't go to the ones that everybody hates. So, but now some people would say, like with movies or books or music, that the tastes of the majority of people who are putting their, you know, their voting 5 stars, you know, online, are not really good. That the taste of the majority of people is not really good, and it represents a sort of lower taste, you might say, than those who know about music or know a lot about movies, you know? I mean, wouldn't some people say, you know, the best movies are the ones that are not watched by very many people, like those independent movies that get made for Sundance Film Festival? Is there any credence we can give to that, or do you think Aristotle is basically right there? I mean, how do you judge between those two arguments? And I've certainly heard many people say that the movies that come to Seth Child Cinema are not worth watching, period. And that you need to, you know, look at the independent films.
I think it's just like a hard argument to make either way, because I feel like if you have like, just talking about music, like folk music, or more like music that's just like of the people, is like awesome, that a lot of people enjoy, and there's something beautiful about that you can relate with others. And then like if you have like some sort of distant jazz piece, I mean, that's like awesome to listen to too. I see like they're both legitimate to, I don't know, I don't think there's one way or the other. Yeah.
You can enjoy both. Both have an argument to be made, but would you disagree with the sort of notion that, so you're saying you don't agree that one is better than the other, basically, they just represent two different tastes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, like with soundtrack music, in the musical world, it's not very difficult normally, and so it tends to be more just music that everyone else likes, but it's not, like it's technically that hard to make, and it's kind of the layman kind of music. That's the impression that I'm given. And so I think there's a difference between creating something and then what other people think is aesthetically pleasing.
Yeah, I mean, some people say that the popular music is not interesting, just like they say that popular movies, you know, they go and they watch them and the plot seems the same as the last 10 movies that they saw, and it just doesn't seem interesting. And I think that the reason why I wanted to bring this discussion out is because this is the sort of difference that develops between Aristotle and his teacher, Plato, because Plato would definitely say that the more complex, the more technically difficult, the more, you know, truly that music or artwork conforms to the laws of beauty and so forth, the better it is. And so people would be better off if they could kind of work their way up to that, because it's more challenging, it makes you think and so forth. But Aristotle, he's not necessarily going to disagree that there's more challenging and less challenging, or more intelligent and less intelligent art forms, but rather because of his focus on the well-being and the happiness of the majority, places more emphasis on them and what it is that they enjoy, what it is that fulfills them. And he's willing to admit, and he readily admits, the vast majority of people, he says right at the top, who are not individuals, excellent men. In other words, the vast majority are not of the very best, you know, the most virtuous and so forth. But they are the vast majority, and they are not cattle, they are not, you know, plebeians, they are citizens. And so just as he favors the middle class because of its stabilizing influence, I think he favors the middle taste as well, the middle in all things. You know, this is where you concentrate your focus. And so they are better judges of the works and of music and the poets for themselves, okay? For what they enjoy, for what makes them enjoy and be happy and so forth. They are the best judges of that. And that's a very different type of statement than what Plato would make. You know, Plato would say, you're not the best judge of what would make you happy, okay? That's exactly what he says. He says most people are not the best judge of what will make them happy. And Aristotle disagrees. Most people have enough judgment to at least know what will make them happy and what will fulfill them. And so he's willing to give them that. And that's an interesting statement, to be sure. He continues on the bottom of 83 saying, by means of these considerations too, one might solve the problem mentioned earlier, and also the related one of what the free should have authority over. That is to say, the multitude of citizens who are not rich and have no claim whatsoever arising from virtue. For it would not be safe to have them participate in the most important offices, see? Okay? So it would not be safe for them, the majority, to participate in the most important offices, since because of their lack of justice and practical wisdom, they would inevitably act unjustly in some instances and make mistakes in others. On the other hand, to give them no share and not to allow them to participate at all would be cause for alarm. For a state in which a large majority of people are excluded from office and are poor must of necessity be full of enemies. The remaining alternative, then, is to have them participate in deliberation and judgment, which is precisely why Solon and some other legislators arranged to have them elect and inspect officials, but prevent them from holding office alone. Solon is an ancient founder of Athens whose legislation or reforms took Athens from really a complete, rule by very few to a little bit more of a republican with some democratic elements. But he did not want the people, the ordinary people, to hold the high offices. Okay, so they would elect and inspect those people. Okay, but they couldn't hold those offices themselves, and that was the beginning of the idea of balancing, the virtues of the few and the virtues of the many. Okay. And he says something at the end there, it's kind of funny. He says, "For when they all come together, their perception is adequate, and when mixed with their betters, they benefit their states, just as a mixture of roughage and pure food concentrate is more useful than a little of the latter by itself." I don't even want to go there. Aristotle has lots of unusual observations, but apparently if you mix the two together, things work more smoothly. So he says all claims to rule are questionable, okay? Again, differing from his teacher Plato. The many, the few, they have their own claims to rule. Both are somewhat legitimate, but you can't give power to either one without excluding the other, and that's unjust. And so he wants them to compromise. But if you ask them to compromise on their own, without rules, without a constitution, then you're more likely to get war than peace. And so in order to make this work, you need to have rule of law, and rule of law needs to replace rule of men, okay? He says on page 97, "The law, having educated the rulers for this special purpose, hands over the rest to be decided and managed in accordance with the most just opinion of the rulers." So here he's talking about the balance between law and judgment, okay? In a good constitution, you need to have law that rules and, you know, sets the boundaries for what each type of citizen can do, what's legal and what's illegal and so forth. But there does have to be room for judgment, because the law can't cover every possible situation. So there he's saying, you know, the rulers must manage, but they manage in accordance with the law, okay, instead of just using their own arbitrary judgment. Moreover, he says it allows them to make corrections by introducing anything found by experience to be an improvement on the existing laws. So the way to make changes in a way that's orderly and doesn't lead to class warfare is to change and adjust through the law, okay? Anyone who instructs law to rule would seem to be asking God and the understanding alone to rule, whereas someone who asks a human being asks a wild beast as well. That's an interesting thing to say. I mean, the way he puts things sometimes, you have to stop and ask yourself, what's he saying there? But he's saying the rule of law is like, almost godlike, okay? It's closer to the wisdom of God. It's godlike because it's more firm, it's more absolute, it's got reason behind it, okay? Whereas if you leave rule to the human being without law, okay, it's more like asking a wild beast to rule. Okay? So by inserting law, by not allowing rulers to just rule based upon their own whims, okay, you elevate and you come closer to natural justice, you come closer to godlike justice. He says, "For appetite is like a wild beast, and passion perverts rulers even when they are the best of men." That's precisely why law is understanding without desire. It removes the passions. If you have a legal system, if you have a constitution, it removes the passions from the situation. And that's something that our Constitution does. We have plenty of passion in our politics, but we have this Constitution that basically reins it in, and which we have to refer back to and we have to follow. And that removes the passion, or at least enough of it, that we can continue to operate in an orderly way, right, in a predictable way. So this is a big difference between democracy and polity, because in a democracy, it's just ruled by the many and they rule however they want. A polity is governed by law. It has a constitution.
So would Aristotle approve of something kind of like what Britain did, has a House of Commons and then a House of Lords, and they're all both
Absolutely.
bound by a constitution? So he what you put right there, how the two interests have to compromise, is that basically what he's talking about? Or is he talking about how if they're making a constitution, the two interests have to be represented, or?
No, that is what he's talking about. He's talking about a constitution which institutionalizes the interests of the few and of the many. So your example of the House of Commons and the House of Lords is perfect, okay? At least is how it was originally intended and developed, right? And in the House of Commons, I mean, they have it set up so that people vote for representatives. The people don't sit there directly, right? They vote for representatives, but the common interests are represented there. And then the interests of the old nobility are represented in the Lords, although that's kind of changed over time, right? And the two have to compromise. They have to come together. They often go back and forth, you know. Again, now in the way that the Constitution has developed in Britain, the House of Commons has a lot more power at this point than the House of Lords. But originally, that was the intent. You know, we need to give the people a place where they can have a voice. They're the taxpayers. They have to, we want them to cooperate, you know, and obey the law and so forth. But these people over here are the wealthy. They contribute a lot more and their interests need to be represented as well. And so it works to balance the two interests. So that's what Aristotle is aiming at. Now, and we need to talk about our own system a little bit, but before we do, we need to talk about his view of oligarchic power. In Book 5, he describes the different types of oligarchic power, the different types of oligarchic systems, you might say. And these aren't the only ones that I can think of, but he lists them at the beginning. There's the type, he says, where anybody who meets a certain property assessment can vote. So depending on how high of a property assessment that is, in other words, how much property you have, you are able to participate, okay? And it could be fairly low, or it could be very high, you know. You could say only people with a net worth of $500,000 can vote in our assembly or whatever. Or you could say anybody with, you know, a house who owns their own home could vote, that kind of thing, okay? So there's a lot of flexibility there. Another way is to say that only those who meet the assessment, whatever it is, can elect representatives. That works for a bigger city or you know, a bigger territory where there are a lot of people. But you still have that property requirement, which would be flexible. Only those with net worth at least $250,000 can go to the voting booth and elect representatives. Okay? And of course, the idea there is, you know, with these oligarchies, it's to protect the property of the wealthy. You know, they want to be able to control their fate, right? Then there's the type of oligarchy which is hereditary, where those who are wealthy and who have held power pass that power to their sons, okay? And there are others who are wealthy who are excluded, okay? And actually, this is kind of like what developed in Europe. You know, there were many people, as time went by, in these European kingdoms who were wealthy because they got wealthy through their own industry, for instance, but they were not able, no matter how wealthy they were, to ever be in the House of Lords, okay? Because they weren't a member of the nobility. And then finally he says there's the oligarchy of heredity, where officials are above the law, so basically, without saying so, he said these three have a law, they have a constitution that determines who can and who cannot vote and so forth. Whereas this is basically tyranny. Okay? You've got this small group of people, they rule as though they are the law and are not governed by any law. Okay? This would obviously be the worst in his view. So oligarchy, he says, is not as good as polity, obviously, and not as good as that, mythical rule of the wise either, if it could, you could have it. But it may be better than democracy, simply because there's more order possible in an oligarchy. I wanted to ask you, given the categories that we've discussed so far that Aristotle has presented to us, how does our own constitution fit? Where would you put us? Would we be a democracy, a polity, or an oligarchy?
I'd say we're a democracy with some oligarchic influences, because I think especially with the way politicians act right now, how they're constantly attached to polls and surveys and stuff whenever they make a decision most of the time. I think that kind of empowers the masses a little bit more, but also with like special interest groups and PACs, the oligarchic sense comes in because like during campaigns and stuff, money talks better.
Okay.
So it's kind of our current politicians caught between the masses within democracy through polls, and then the rich businessmen or whatever through campaign finances and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So
okay, there's some good reasons there. I wonder if, in a way, now we have to say just right off the bat that for Aristotle, democracy, he uses the term very purely to mean direct democracy. So we don't quite fit it there. But what you're talking about is in our system, the people rule, but there's the influence of the wealthy that has quite a lot of influence, the influence of special interests and so forth. And they both exist and kind of compete with each other, right?
mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah.
I was going to say, kind of what you said about him, what he thought about democracy. So I said we weren't that. We do have a constitution that we do have like the law rules, and so I'd say we're probably like the polity that he has in democracy or oligarchy.
Yeah, I mean, it's because of the way that Aristotle defines democracy. I mean, pure democracy, the people rule, not the law, right? So because we have a constitution, and we have a mixed regime, it wouldn't qualify as what he calls democracy because of that. Democracy for him is pretty close to mob rule, so our system is better than that. But you've made a point about the influence of the wealthy that many people have made. That is that we have the ability to vote as citizens for our representatives, both in the House and Senate, but it seems as though the influence of money makes it so that some people and groups do have more political influence, because those are the people who can make the most political contributions, and they can influence popular opinion in that way. So would that make us more of a polity, as you say? I mean, is that more where we are? Or would you go so far as to say we're actually an oligarchy?
I wouldn't say we're an oligarchy.
Okay, you wouldn't go that
I
far.
think we still have enough influence amongst the masses to sway what happens in government. I feel like an oligarchy we could vote or have our say, but they'd still just make sure the rich stay in complete control. I mean, I know that's kind of how it is. I mean, we do have elections where there's still the elections are still followed and obeyed.
All right, so a real oligarchy is where the people are excluded, and where only people with a certain amount of wealth can even participate at all. So we don't have that. Well, if our system is closer to a polity, we still need to ask whether it really follows what does it follow Aristotle's priorities, I guess you might say, and what Aristotle values. Would he like the amount of influence the wealthy have in our regime, based on what he said? Or the type of influence? Does it reflect that, we've heard him say that a polity is a mixture democracy and oligarchy under the law, under a constitution, right? So kind of like the House of Commons and the House of Lords working together, so to speak, or arguing with each other. Okay? So does the influence of the wealthy in our system reflect that or serve that same type of purpose?
I would say that Aristotle probably thinks that the wealthy have a little bit too much influence, because even though we do have a constitution and at the end of the day the masses still are the ones who vote, depending on how much money a politician gets, really tells how much airtime or how much they can get their own word out. So in a way, wealthy greatly affect who actually is elected or who can run for office. Because it takes a certain amount of money to run. If you can't get people to back you, you're not going to run. So that takes out a lot of people who could be very good for political positions on the race. And sometimes the money can clog when information gets out there. And so we probably say that the wealthy do have a, spot that they just too much money influencing us instead of actual real information.
Yeah, it's interesting. There is a great influence of the wealthy in our system, and the way that it works is, whether you're wealthy or not, when you run for office, you have to collect a great deal of money in order to run for office. Even at the local level, it seems like anymore. It's a minimum of maybe $30,000 and a maximum of $70,000 to $100,000 to get something like a city commission seat. Seriously. And so, where do you get that money? Well, you can try to get a lot of money from a lot of small donors, but practically speaking, you do have to, and you really should, knock on the doors of people who have the maximum amount of money to give. You have to be competitive. So the system drives the candidates towards the big donors out of necessity so that they can get their message out and be competitive. And I wonder if that, it's not that Aristotle doesn't want the influence of the wealthy. He does. He believes that's a legitimate interest. Okay? It's a legitimate interest that needs to have a voice, and a disproportionate voice relative to the numbers, because the wealthy have a great stake in the society. In our terms, they're the employers, right? They're the people who, they create the wealth that other people get jobs and live from, right? So in his view, they should have maybe even a disproportionate amount of influence, but the influence that they have is channeled through a body, like the House of Lords used to be, okay? Or maybe like the Senate in our own system used to be, maybe a little bit closer, right? Although not quite. But remember, originally our Constitution had our senators selected by the state legislatures, and so there probably was a greater likelihood that the people elected to the Senate were kind of the cream of the crop from the various states, more likely to be wealthy, very prominent people. Okay? Now they're directly elected by the people. They're probably still mainly wealthy, I would say, but there's a difference in how they're elected that may lead to a diminishment of that function. Okay? So would Aristotle prefer, and would it be better, if our Senate was just openly a body of those people who qualified for the seats because of a property qualification? In other words, we're allowed, maybe we would be allowed to vote for them, but the only candidates eligible to be selected were people with net worth of, well, gosh, in this country, $10 million or higher, or something like that, or maybe even more. Okay? I mean, I'm not saying that the American people would ever go for this, but isn't that something like what Aristotle would prefer? And isn't it more honest in a way? Okay? Because what we have now is we have the wealthy money sort of driving our political process. So they have influence over the whole process, the choices of the voters. And yet it's kind of hidden from us. Whereas if we had Aristotle's system, we would just be acknowledging the fact that the wealthy must be a part of the political process, and they have an interest in doing so. And then we'd have one body that represents the very wealthy interests, and we'd have one body that represents the common people. Okay? Why don't you think that, I have a sense that most of the American people would find that to be a very hard pill to swallow, though. I mean, what do you think?
Well, I think one issue is that there's so many more people who are wealthy than there are who wealthy, so it's like, how much power would they get? I mean, they may have like their own section just because of their wealth. Seems a little bit like ridiculous in a way, because like you should, like, most of the power should be with the majority of people, with the common people, instead of with the wealthy. So it's almost like putting it like on a higher pedestal, like, well, because you have so much wealth, you're going to have your own section of importance, and everyone else is just another group. So.
Oh, it definitely would. It would definitely be acknowledging and saying, you people are different, and you have your different separate interests, and we have to deal with that, you know. And I think you're right that people would find that to be almost shocking, you know, to give people power simply because of their economic power. And yet we do that anyway. I mean, the thing that Aristotle understands that we kind of don't want to admit to ourselves is that people with a lot of money will always have a lot of political power. Okay? So what he's doing is he's just bringing it out into the open so that everybody can see it, and basically institutionalizing the interests of the wealthy and everybody else, and saying, you know, for a society to work, these two groups have to understand each other. They have to be forced, basically, to deal with each other's interests. Okay, because in his view, class, economic class, is not ever going to go away as an issue. You know, the existence of a large middle class makes things better because they are not so desperate for just survival that they will basically try to use the political process to rob other people of their wealth, and they'll feel like they have a stake in the system too. But there will always be these separate interests, and he wants these two parties to actually openly admit these separate interests and negotiate with each other, so that the wealthy sees their interest in developing the well-being of the many, okay, and the many see their own self-interest in preserving what the wealthy provide. Isn't that interesting? You know? Whereas what you get without this type of constitution, in his view back then, was just full-out class warfare, where people start to fight with each other out of envy or desperation or whatever, leads to civil wars and the destruction of states. Okay. Now I don't know what he would say about our system. I would say he probably would like it, but maybe not as much as his own proposal. It's a mixed system. It pits interest against interest in a different way, you know, through regional interests, and, you know, through the different types of interests that are represented by different states and different parts of the country and so forth, and just the two institutions, House and Senate, and the executive branch. We all know this. So it fulfills some of those purposes, but not as openly and as honestly as Aristotle's system of just saying, look, you know, the rich and the poor, they're two parties that will always be with us. They need to be made to see their what they have in common and what they can agree to. Okay, but the way that we do it sort of hides that, or puts a veil over it. Okay, which I think Aristotle would say is a flaw, a dangerous flaw, because underlying it there is still the potential for class warfare. Okay. So, just something to think about. So polity is a fusion, as he puts it, of oligarchy and democracy, with these elements, just to kind of sum up here. Rule of law, okay, that's the Constitution and the laws that the two parties come to an agreement and legislate. It's a balance of the rich with everybody else. I put everybody else because hopefully it's not just the poor. It requires virtue or excellence that's not beyond the reach of ordinary people. So in neither body, in neither part of that Constitution are we going to require great, extraordinary wisdom. But we're going to count upon the practical experience and practical knowledge of a lot of people. Okay? It requires an education, he says, that everybody can attain, which is a civic education. Just knowing your duties as a citizen, being informed on how to participate, and being encouraged to think about the common good. And it prioritizes the growth of the middle class, because the great stabilizer is the middle class. So hopefully both the rich and the poor could come to agreements that would lead to the development of a middle class, which is very different from the way things tended to go back then, where the rich tried to keep as much of their money as possible and didn't really care whether they impoverished everybody else. Okay? So in practical terms, this would mean legislation that allows people to keep more of their own money and property so that they could develop it, right? So that they could have what they need to move from poor to middle class. Okay? So the rich would have to realize that some legislation, that which is designed to keep people poor and ignorant, is inadvisable for their own welfare. Okay? So isn't it kind of surprising that somebody way back in ancient Greece could think this clearly about what actually works? And you can see our founders gained a lot of knowledge from both Greek history and Greek philosophy, and you could see the influence coming through in the Federalist Papers, for instance.